The arid desert shimmered under a brutal sun, the air thick with the acrid scent of ozone and burning metal. A sleek, intimidating enemy tank, all angular composites and menacing railgun, pivoted with terrifying speed, its primary cannon spitting a kinetic slug that tore through a friendly armored personnel carrier like tissue paper. The explosion blossomed into a fiery mushroom cloud, casting a momentary, grim shadow across the battlefield. Then, a quick, jarring cut, a cramped, dusty tent, the flickering beam of a tactical flashlight illuminating the aged, sepia-toned pages of a tattered, leather-bound book. The hands clutched it with a familiar reverence, calloused fingers tracing faded diagrams of bolted steel and rudimentary tracks. This was not a modern tactical guide, it was a relic, a manual from a war fought a century ago, World War I. This was Sergeant Elias Vance, a man forged in the crucible of modern armored warfare, yet one who carried the weight of history in his very bones. Elias was a tank commander, a veteran of countless engagements, his face a road map of hard-won experience. In his unit, he was known for his uncanny ability to see beyond the conventional, his mind a labyrinth of unorthodox strategies. But lately, that unconventional streak had landed him in hot water. A miscalculation, as command had delicately put it, had led to a significant loss of equipment, and Elias found himself metaphorically, if not physically, sidelined. His current role felt more like a demotion, relegated to supporting skirmishes while the main force bled itself dry against an enemy that seemed to have leapt a generation ahead in technological prowess. The shadows of his past, particularly his family's deep military lineage, pressed down on him, none more so than the spectral presence of his great-grandfather, a tank crewman in the muddy fields of the First World War. That war manual wasn't just a book, it was a physical link, a whisper from a time when steel beasts first clawed their way across battlefields. Now Elias's unit, what remained of it, was cornered. The situation was desperate, a grinding, suffocating trap closing in with undeniable finality. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered by the enemy's terrifying new generation of main battle tanks. These machines, faster, smarter, and armored with an almost impenetrable composite weave, rendered every standard operating procedure obsolete. Their own tanks, once formidable, now felt like lumbering, vulnerable targets. Every volley they fired seemed to glance off the enemy's frontal plating, while every return shot found its mark with chilling precision. Morale, once a stubborn flame, flickered precariously, threatening to extinguish completely. The casualty reports grew longer by the hour, each name a fresh wound in the unit's collective spirit. The air hummed with the silent, desperate question, how could they possibly survive this? How could they stand a chance against technology that felt like it belonged to another era entirely? Their standard tactics, forged in decades of doctrine, were failing spectacularly, leading them down a path towards inevitable destruction. The weight of command, of every life under his responsibility, bore down on Elias, a crushing burden that amplified the silent scream of impending defeat. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that something fundamental had to change, and fast. Before we dive into how a century-old book saved the day, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community for more incredible untold stories. The enemy's advanced armor, specifically their new, Vanguard, Panzer units, seemed to laugh in the face of Elias's unit's conventional firepower. Their sophisticated targeting systems could lock onto targets at ranges previously thought impossible, striking with pinpoint accuracy before Elias's tanks could even get a clear bead on them. It felt as if they were fighting ghosts, seeing the flash of an enemy cannon, feeling the impact, before even understanding where the shot originated. To compound their misery, communications were intermittently jammed, cutting off vital intel and coordination between subunits. Supply lines, already stretched thin, were now routinely ambushed and severed, leaving them critically low on fuel, ammunition, and even basic rations. The strategic withdrawal had devolved into a desperate scramble, a grim game of cat and mouse where they were perpetually the mouse. Retreat was becoming an impossibility, encirclement a looming threat. Surrender, a word Elias had never allowed himself to entertain, began to whisper in the minds of some exhausted soldiers, a dark, seductive promise of an end to the ceaseless terror. Captain Ramirez, Elias's commanding officer, a man known for his unflappable demeanor, now carried the heavy burden of command with deeply etched lines of stress around his eyes. He paced anxiously in the makeshift command tent, the glow of holographic maps casting an eerie light on his worried face. Ramirez was under immense pressure from high command to hold the line, to somehow turn the tide, but every report painted a grimmer picture. He respected Elias's tactical acumen but was inherently wary of his more unorthodox proposals, especially after the recent incident that had seen Elias's unit nearly decimate itself. The military doctrine, rigidly adhered to for decades, offered no solutions for this new breed of adversary. The primary obstacle wasn't just the sheer number of enemy tanks, but the overwhelming technological superiority of these vanguard Panzer units. Their frontal armor was, for all intents and purposes, impenetrable to current kinetic rounds, and their long-range precision meant they dictated the terms of every engagement. Beyond the external threat, there was an internal enemy as well, the entrenched dogma within their own command structure, a resistance to any tactics that deviated from the established, albeit failing, norm. Innovation was often seen as insubordination, a dangerous gamble rather than a necessity. Elias, seeing the despair creeping into his unit, felt a surge of desperation. He began proposing asymmetrical tactics, ideas born from late-night studies of military history, not just his great-grandfather's World War I exploits, but every conflict he could get his hands on. He suggested using terrain more aggressively, creating false fronts with smoke and dummy targets, or even attempting highly risky, close-quarters maneuvers to bypass the vanguard's frontal defenses. His initial suggestions, minor deviations from standard doctrine, were cautious attempts to introduce new thinking without outright challenging the established order. Yet they were met with immediate skepticism. "Too risky, Vance," Ramirez would often sigh, running a hand through his hair. "We don't have the luxury for experiments." Another officer would dismissively state, "Modern warfare demands modern solutions, Sergeant, not dusty historical anecdotes." Elias argued that fundamental principles of warfare remained constant, that terrain and psychology could still be leveraged, but his words fell on deaf ears. He felt the crushing weight of his unit's impending doom, the unspoken accusation in the eyes of his men. Their lives, he knew, depended on a radical shift, but how could he convince a system so rigid in its thinking to embrace the wildly unconventional? The clock was ticking, and with every tick, another life was lost, another hope extinguished. The desperation in his heart grew, realizing that conventional thinking was a death sentence. The desperation in his heart grew, realizing that conventional thinking was a death sentence. That stark realization hammered home during a routine reconnaissance mission. Elias, leading a smaller, lightly armored unit, was tasked with monitoring a known enemy supply route. The mission was meant to be quick, covert, a low-risk intelligence-gathering operation. But intelligence, as Elias knew, was often a fleeting commodity on this battlefield. They were moving through a narrow canyon, visibility limited by swirling dust kicked up by a sudden desert squall, when the world fractured. A vanguard Panzer, seemingly appearing from nowhere, its immense form materializing like a silent predator from the dust, trapped them. The lead vehicle in Elias's formation, a light scout, evaporated in a blinding flash of kinetic energy before its crew could even register the threat. The ambush was swift, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Elias's unit scattered, their smaller vehicles hopelessly outmatched. He ordered evasive maneuvers, directing sporadic suppressive fire to buy precious seconds, but it was futile. He watched, horrified, as another of his vehicles was systematically torn apart. His own tank, a heavier but still inadequate model, barely dodged a primary cannon shot that cratered the rock face where they had been moments before. Amidst the chaos, the deafening explosions, and the screams of his men, a single detail burned itself into Elias's mind. As the vanguard Panzer rotated its massive turret to acquire another target, its rear quarter, briefly exposed, seemed disproportionately sluggish. Its powerful tracks, designed for speed and stability, struggled to realign the entire chassis quickly in the tight, uneven terrain. There was a noticeable, almost archaic, delay in its full-body traversal compared to the almost instant turret rotation. It was a fleeting observation, a microsecond glimpse of a vulnerability, but it was enough. They were nearly wiped out, escaping only due to the Vanguard's sudden, inexplicable decision to break off the engagement, perhaps due to new orders or a perceived lack of strategic value in continuing the pursuit of such small fry. Deeply shaken by the near-fatal encounter, the memory of that sluggish movement, that exposed blind spot, gnawed at Elias. It was a detail that resonated with something ancient, something buried in his subconscious. He returned to their temporary encampment, the smell of burnt fuel and dying hopes clinging to his uniform. He ignored the sympathetic glances and the hushed conversations. His mind was elsewhere, circling back to that momentary weakness. He remembered the old World War I tank crew manual, the one he had held just days ago, the familiar weight of it in his hands. It wasn't just a sentimental keepsake. It was a desperate hunch, a whisper from the past demanding to be heard. He went to his personal effects, a canvas duffel bag tucked beneath his bunk, and pulled out the worn, leather-bound volume. Its title, faded but still legible, read, Manual for Mark IV Tank Crewmen, Principles of Armored Combat. He flipped through its yellowed pages, the scent of aged paper and forgotten battles filling his nostrils. The manual was filled with hand-drawn diagrams, crude but effective, illustrating everything from engine maintenance to tactical formations. Interspersed among the printed text were his great-grandfather's own notes, scribbled in elegant, looping script, observations from the front, personal insights, and even little tactical doodles. It was a tangible connection to a past where tanks were new, terrifying, and fundamentally understood differently. As Elias sat there, poring over the ancient text, a few curious crew members approached. First, Sergeant Miller, his gunner, a man known for his dry wit, peered over Elias's shoulder. "What's that, Elias? A field guide to horse-drawn artillery?" he quipped, a wry smile playing on his lips. Soon, Captain Ramirez himself approached, drawn by the unusual sight. He looked at the antique manual, then at the grim, determined set of Elias's jaw. A small, disbelieving laugh escaped him. "Sergeant Vance, are you truly suggesting we find answers against their vanguards in a book that predates our grandfathers?" he asked, his voice laced with a mixture of exhaustion and incredulity. The others, emboldened by Ramirez's reaction, joined in. "Maybe it has a chapter on how to charm their rail guns with a peace treaty," someone joked from the back. Another chimed in. "Or how to use carrier pigeons for air support." The ridicule, though good-natured in some cases, was undeniable. They scoffed, openly mock-laughed at the absurdity of the idea that anything from a century ago, from an era of slow, clunky metal boxes, could be remotely relevant against a futuristic tank that defied all modern understanding. Elias endured their mockery, the sound washing over him, not unnoticed, but unheeded. He simply nodded, a quiet resolve hardening his features. Their skepticism was understandable, even expected. But Elias had seen something in that canyon, a fundamental flaw that the World War I manual, in its crude simplicity, might just illuminate. He had a hunch, a desperate one, that some principles of war, like gravity, remained constant, even across 100 years of technological leaps. And he was going to find it. That fundamental flaw, that whisper from the past, began to manifest as Elias delved deeper into the aged manual. He ignored the lingering snickers and the raised eyebrows, his focus absolute. He found a chapter titled, Anti-Tank Tactics for the Mark IV, a section filled with stark line drawings depicting various engagement scenarios. What struck him immediately was the emphasis on close-quarters combat, on maneuvering into flanking positions, and on exploiting the limited traverse speeds of early tank turrets. The Mark IV, for all its revolutionary impact, was a ponderous beast, its main armament often fixed or with an extremely narrow arc of fire, forcing the entire vehicle to reorient itself to engage targets. This insight clicked with his observation of the Vanguard Panzer's sluggish full-body movement in the canyon. He saw a striking resemblance between the operational principles of those early, cumbersome tanks and the observed vulnerabilities of the modern Vanguard, particularly regarding its target acquisition and traversal mechanisms under specific, high-stress circumstances. The manual repeatedly stressed the importance of gaining the flank, even if it meant exposing oneself to enemy fire momentarily, because a side or rear shot, even from less powerful weaponry, could disable a tank that was otherwise invulnerable from the front. This tactic, universally deemed suicidal with modern weaponry, began to make a terrifying kind of sense. The Vanguard, with its impenetrable frontal armor, was designed for long-range engagements, for picking off targets from afar. Its advanced targeting systems, while incredibly precise over distance, seemed to struggle with extreme close proximity and rapid, unpredictable motion. The manual spoke of closing the distance with speed and audacity, of using terrain to mask one's approach, and then delivering a decisive blow at point-blank range. Elias began to see the Vanguard not as an invincible titan, but as a heavily armored knight with superb jousting skills, but terrible at close-in sword fighting. The secret lay not in countering its strengths, but in forcing it into situations where its strengths became its weaknesses. He began to formulate a daring plan, one born from desperation and the faded wisdom of a century-old book. It centered on using the natural terrain, the very canyons and broken urban landscapes where they were fighting, to create diversions and initiate a high-risk, close-quarters ambush. The goal was to exploit the Vanguard's specific blind spots, the areas where its multispectral sensors might have gaps, or where its massive, powerful turrets simply couldn't traverse fast enough at extreme angles to track an agile, rapidly closing target. It was a plan that felt counterintuitive, a direct affront to every modern tank doctrine that preached standoff engagements and technological superiority. But Elias believed it was their only chance. Presenting the plan to Captain Ramirez was a daunting prospect. Elias knew he would face immense resistance. The captain sat across a makeshift table, maps spread before him, his face etched with another layer of worry. "Captain," Elias began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I've found something in here that might just work." He pushed the worn manual across the table. Ramirez eyed it with suspicion, but the usual jest was absent from his voice. "Vance, we don't have time for your historical curiosities. We're losing men by the hour." Elias took a deep breath. "Sir, the Vanguard isn't invincible. I saw weakness in the canyon. Its full-body traversal is slow at extreme angles. Its targeting systems, while advanced, are designed for range. They struggle up close, especially when paired with rapid, unpredictable movement." He pointed to a crude diagram in the manual. "This manual, sir, talks about exploiting the limited traverse of World War I tanks. It tells us to get close, to use the terrain to force them into a situation where their strengths become their weaknesses." Elias passionately argued his case, referencing the specific flaws he observed in the Vanguard. He described how the Vanguard's sheer size and focus on long-range stability made its close-quarters agility and target acquisition at extreme angles a critical vulnerability. He explained how the manual's diagrams, showing tactics like cutting across a tank's line of sight or using broken ground for concealment, were not mere historical footnotes but fundamental principles of tank warfare that transcended technological eras. The principles of armor, of targeting, of maneuver. Elias concluded. They haven't changed, sir. Only the technology has masked them. Captain Ramirez listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to a deep frown. He picked up the manual, leafing through the ancient pages, his eyes scanning the faded script. He muttered, "You're suggesting we use tactics from 100 years ago, to fight a tank that operates a century ahead?" He looked up, his eyes meeting Elias's. "Against the Vanguard? That's insane, Vance. It's suicide." Elias held his gaze. "Perhaps, sir. Or perhaps it's the only sanity left." The silence in the tent stretched, heavy with the weight of desperation and the audacity of the proposal. Ramirez leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose, the fate of his unit hanging in the balance. The silence in the tent stretched, heavy with the weight of desperation and the audacity of the proposal. Ramirez leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose, the fate of his unit hanging in the balance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed, a sound of profound resignation. "All right, Vance," he said, his voice low. "There are no other viable options on the table. Every conventional tactic we've thrown at them has failed, and more men die every hour. We deliberate." He looked Elias straight in the eye, a glint of despair mixed with a sliver of desperate hope. "I'll give you a chance. Not because I believe in your antique book, but because I believe in your conviction, and frankly, because we're out of choices." It was a grudging acceptance, born of necessity rather than faith, but it was acceptance nonetheless. Ramirez agreed to allow Elias to lead a small, specialized unit, hand-picked for their skill and, more importantly, their unwavering loyalty to Elias, to test his theory. The stakes were impossibly high. Failure wouldn't just mean the loss of Elias's small team, but likely the complete annihilation of the entire remaining expeditionary force. With Ramirez's reluctant blessing, Elias immediately began the meticulous preparation. He assembled his crew: Miller, the cynical but fiercely loyal gunner; Chen, the quiet but brilliant driver, whose ability to navigate any terrain was legendary; and Rodriguez, the loader, whose speed and precision under pressure were unmatched. Together they spent grueling hours poring over the World War I manual, translating its archaic language and crudely drawn diagrams into modern tactical applications. Elias explained the concepts, the nuances of close-quarters engagements, and the vital importance of exploiting the enemy's blind spots. They practiced the precise maneuvers and the almost balletic coordination required, often in secret, using dilapidated, older model tanks from the scrap heaps of their base. These training sessions were brutal, pushing both man and machine to their limits. They modified their own tanks slightly, not with advanced technology, but with scavenged parts and ingenuity, reinforcing track skirts for better deflection, recalibrating targeting systems for extreme close-range accuracy, and even painting their hulls with non-reflective, terrain-mimicking patterns to enhance concealment. It was all about speed, stealth, and surprise. Chen, with his intuitive understanding of mechanics, quickly grasped the concept of forcing the vanguard into an awkward position, a place where its massive processing power and long-range sensors would become a liability rather than an asset. Miller worked tirelessly to re-zero his main cannon, making minute adjustments to compensate for the close-range ballistics, a skill that most modern gunners never needed to master. Rodriguez, in turn, developed an almost rhythmic speed in reloading, anticipating every command. The focus was on operating as a single, cohesive entity, each member understanding their role in a complex, multi-stage maneuver. A key part of their plan revolved around a concept Elias dubbed the Mockingbird tactic. This was a direct adaptation of an old World War I ambush strategy for luring enemy armor into traps, a page from his great-grandfather's manual depicting crude decoys and diversionary movements. In their modern context, it involved using auditory and visual decoys, automated drones broadcasting engine noises and thermal signatures, paired with small, fast-moving vehicles designed to draw the vanguard's attention and force it into a vulnerable position. The idea was to present a tempting, yet ultimately harmless, target that would entice the enemy to pursue, leading them away from their main formation and into a predetermined kill zone. It was a calculated gamble, relying on the vanguard crew's probable overconfidence in their technological superiority, and their expectation of long-range engagements. They would be lured in, thinking they had the advantage, only to find themselves ensnared in a century-old trap, re-engineered for the modern battlefield. Every detail, every sequence, was rehearsed until it became second nature. The fate of their entire command now rested on 4 men, 3 old tanks, and a very old book. The fate of their entire command now rested on 4 men, 3 old tanks, and a very old book. Elias's small unit, a silent procession of heavily modified armored vehicles, moved out under the shrouding blanket of a moonless night. The hum of their engines was barely a whisper against the vast silence of the desert, their tracks kicking up plumes of fine dust that dissolved into the inky blackness. Each man was a coiled spring of tension, the air inside their cramped tanks thick with anticipation and the metallic tang of fear. Their mission, to intercept a known vanguard patrol, a route identified through painstaking satellite imagery and brave, clandestine reconnaissance. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat, every distant glint of light a potential enemy sensor. They navigated treacherous terrain, rock-strewn ridges and sudden, deep ravines, relying on Chen's uncanny ability to read the ground and Elias's instinctual understanding of strategic movement, avoiding the visible and invisible webs of enemy scanners that crisscrossed the sector. The silence was punctuated only by Elias's low, steady commands, guiding them through the labyrinthine landscape. Hours crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity, until finally, the thermal signatures appeared on their enhanced scopes. Not one, but two Vanguard Panzers, moving in a loose formation, their advanced optics sweeping the horizon with an almost predatory arrogance. This was it. The moment of truth. The initial engagement was a storm of calculated chaos. Elias gave the signal, and from a prepositioned staging area, the Mockingbird tactic was unleashed. Small, agile drones, mimicking the thermal and acoustic signatures of a larger tank, sped out from behind a rise, drawing the attention of one of the vanguards. Loud, distorted engine noises erupted from their integrated speakers, designed to mimic a damaged, fleeing vehicle. As expected, the first Vanguard Panzer, its advanced targeting systems locking onto the perceived easy prey, altered its course, veering away from its patrol partner to pursue the decoy. Its massive cannon swiveled, a silent promise of destruction, focused entirely on the mock target. This was their window. As the Vanguard engaged the decoy, Elias's tank, Avenger, along with Fury, the second tank commanded by his trusted junior lieutenant, maneuvered with a calculated precision that belied their age. They hugged the contours of a jagged ridge, their low-profile modifications and specialized camouflage making them almost invisible against the natural rock formations. Then, utilizing a cluster of pre-identified destroyed buildings and debris as cover, they broke from concealment, closing the distance at an alarming speed. This was the suicidal range, the zone where modern doctrine screamed for retreat, where armor was supposed to be most vulnerable. But Elias knew, with a certainty honed by his great-grandfather's manual, that within this forbidden zone lay the Vanguard's Achilles heel. They were operating in a range considered suicidal by every modern tactical manual, pushing past the recognized boundaries of engagement, entering a world where the enemy's technological superiority was supposed to guarantee their demise. The ground shuddered under their tracks, every rivet and plate groaning under the strain as they hurtled towards their unsuspecting quarry, a ghost of a century-old battle plan guiding their desperate, daring charge. The ground shuddered under their tracks, every rivet and plate groaning under the strain as they hurtled towards their unsuspecting quarry, a ghost of a century-old battle plan guiding their desperate, daring charge. Elias's tank, Avenger, slammed to a halt at an extreme, almost perpendicular, angle to the now confused Vanguard. The enemy tank's massive main cannon, still oriented towards the Mockingbird decoy, struggled to reacquire. Its advanced targeting system, designed for calculated long-range precision, became a liability at such close, unconventional range. The digital displays inside the Vanguard's cockpit, usually filled with precise, color-coded data, flickered erratically as the sensors struggled to process the sudden, overwhelming proximity of a new, unexpected threat. The manual's insights about archaic turret traverse limitations resonated with chilling accuracy. The Vanguard's turret, while formidable, was designed for sweeping arcs across vast distances, not the frantic, almost contorted rotation now demanded of it. Its heavy, segmented armor plates, meant to deflect most threats from afar, created blind spots at these extreme angles, exactly as the World War I manual had implicitly suggested. This was a dance of death, choreographed by forgotten wisdom. The Vanguard's crew, accustomed to the detachment of long-range engagements, where enemies were tiny blips on a screen, were visibly disoriented by the unexpected proximity and the sheer audacity of Elias's attack. Their internal communications crackled with confused exclamations, their cool, detached professionalism shattered by the intimate, brutal reality of close-quarters tank warfare. The massive machine began a slow, grinding rotation, attempting to bring its primary weapon to bear, but Elias had anticipated this. Chen, his driver, had positioned Avenger perfectly, hugging a concave depression in the terrain, making them a difficult target even as the Vanguard's secondary weapons spat futile tracers across their hull. Elias's heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of their own engine, yet his voice was calm, clear, imbued with absolute authority as he watched the Vanguard's slow, agonizing turn through his magnified optics. "Miller!" Elias commanded, his voice slicing through the cacophony of metal on metal. "Target Quadrant 3, upper armor. Below the comms array. Fire on my mark!" Miller, his face a mask of intense concentration, had already compensated for the extreme angle and the bizarrely close range, his sights dancing over the specific vulnerability Elias had identified. It was a section of the Vanguard's top armor, ostensibly protected by reactive plating, but thinner than its frontal or side armor, a spot meant to withstand air-to-ground attacks, not a direct, high-velocity kinetic round from such an absurd proximity. This weakness, a compromise in design in order to save weight and improve anti-air capabilities, had been overlooked by conventional anti-tank tactics focusing on frontal assaults. Yet, the World War I manual, in its crude diagrams of top-down attacks on early tanks, had implicitly identified such vulnerabilities as crucial targets if one could only get into position. It was a flaw that, in a different form, had persisted across a century of evolution in tank design, a testament to the enduring principles of protective geometry and projectile physics. "Target acquired, Sergeant!" Miller's voice rang out, steady and precise. "Mark!" Elias bellowed, and the Avenger bucked violently. A blinding flash erupted from its main cannon, followed by a shockwave that rattled every rivet in their tank. The kinetic round, launched with devastating force from point-blank range, slammed into the designated spot on the Vanguard's upper glassy plate. There was a sickening, metallic shriek, a sound of tearing steel, followed by a deafening internal explosion that ripped through the enemy tank. Black smoke belched from the Vanguard's crippled frame, quickly followed by tendrils of orange flame. The massive machine shuddered, then listed violently, its tracks grinding to a halt. Its advanced systems, its long-range precision, its impenetrable frontal armor, all rendered useless by one perfectly placed shot, a shot guided by a century-old manual and an indomitable will. The shot crippled the Vanguard, silencing its electronic growl and its threat. The surprised enemy crew, accustomed to the sterile detachment of long-range combat, panicked. Their advanced systems, which had provided such a sense of invincibility, now failed them spectacularly. The internal explosion had not been catastrophic enough to destroy the tank entirely, but it had catastrophically damaged vital internal components, jamming the turret and disabling the main weapon systems. The Vanguard was effectively neutralized, a giant, smoking hulk. But there was no time for celebration. The second Vanguard, alerted by the explosion, was already shifting its focus. Fury, Elias's second tank, driven by Lieutenant Chavez, was already moving, executing the same daring close-in maneuver. Avenger, rapidly repositioned, providing covering fire and drawing the attention of the remaining Vanguard's secondary weapons. Elias's team moved with an almost supernatural coordination, applying the same principles, exploiting the same vulnerabilities. They were ghosts in the machine, ancient warriors fighting with modern steel, turning the enemy's strengths into their own undoing. The surprised enemy crew, accustomed to the sterile detachment of long-range combat, panicked. Their advanced systems, which had provided such a sense of invincibility, now failed them spectacularly. The internal explosion had not been catastrophic enough to destroy the tank entirely, but it had catastrophically damaged vital internal components, jamming the turret and disabling the main weapon systems. The Vanguard was effectively neutralized, a giant, smoking hulk. But there was no time for celebration. The second Vanguard, alerted by the explosion, was already shifting its focus. Fury, Elias's second tank, driven by Lieutenant Chavez, was already moving, executing the same daring close-in maneuver. Avenger, rapidly repositioned, providing covering fire and drawing the attention of the remaining Vanguard's secondary weapons. Elias's team moved with an almost supernatural coordination, applying the same principles, exploiting the same vulnerabilities. They were ghosts in the machine, ancient warriors fighting with modern steel, turning the enemy's strengths into their own undoing. Elias's small unit, employing the tactics deemed outdated by every contemporary military strategist, managed to neutralize not just one, but a significant portion of the vanguard threat that night. They didn't destroy every single one, but they crippled enough, sowing enough confusion and fear, to buy crucial time for their main force. The subsequent days saw a dramatic shift in the conflict's momentum. The news of Elias's audacious, successful ambush sent shockwaves through the command structure, reaching even the highest echelons. Initial disbelief quickly morphed into intense scrutiny, followed by a grudging, then enthusiastic, acceptance of his unconventional methods. Captain Ramirez, initially Elias's most vocal skeptic, became his fiercest advocate, presenting Elias's detailed after-action reports and the World War I manual itself as tangible proof of concept. Other units, desperate and encouraged by Elias's unprecedented success, began to cautiously adopt adapted versions of his tactics. The mockingbird decoy became standard procedure. Close-quarters combat, once an absolute taboo against the vanguards, was now studied and practiced with a new, urgent focus. Commanders started scrutinizing terrain in new ways, searching for the very blind spots and choke points that Elias had so effectively exploited. The tide of the conflict, which had seemed irrevocably against them, slowly but surely began to turn. The enemy, once seemingly invincible, found their technological superiority countered by ingenuity and a return to fundamental principles of warfare. Elias, once sidelined and ridiculed, earned not just the respect of his peers and superiors, but the quiet admiration of every soldier who now had a fighting chance against the vanguard. His great-grandfather's manual, once an object of amusement, became a revered symbol of innovative thinking, a testament to the enduring wisdom of history. It was studied, copied, and its lessons integrated into modern training programs, no longer a quaint relic but a living, breathing tactical Bible. Weeks later, the battlefield was still a chaotic tapestry of destruction and valor, but the grim specter of inevitable defeat had lifted. Elias found a rare moment of quiet solitude in his tank, the desert evening cooling the air. He held the worn World War I manual in his hands, its leather cover softened by decades of handling, its pages a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge. He traced the faded ink of his great-grandfather's notes, a quiet sense of pride and profound connection washing over him. It wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about honoring a legacy, about proving that human ingenuity, courage, and unconventional thinking could indeed overcome seemingly insurmountable technological superiority. The story wasn't just about a tank, it was about the enduring power of lessons learned, about how the past could illuminate the path forward, and how a deep understanding of fundamental principles could outwit the most advanced machinery. It was a testament to the timeless truth that the human element, when combined with the wisdom of the ages, remains the ultimate weapon. What other forgotten wisdom do you think could turn the tide in modern challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more incredible tales, and click on the next video for another journey into the past.